I'm Shadi Sharif, and this is Cyborg. What is your cultural identity, and how was it formed? One of the biggest challenges immigrant parents face when raising their kids in America is balancing their home culture with American culture. And while some parents really want their children to learn their home culture, others don't particularly care. So, in today's episode, we're going to explore how a young person's cultural identity is formed. And since the start of my show, I've really wanted to have on someone from my immediate family. And maybe rightfully so, they've been a little bit hesitant to come on. But I was finally able to convince my brother to come on. So, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about how our cultural identities are similar, how they're different, and why that might be. So without further ado, Cyrus, welcome to Cyborg.
Thank you for having me. Really excited to be here. It did take some convincing, but the podcast has been great. I've loved listening to every episode and excited to be doing a special one with you right now.
I'm really excited for this episode too, especially because I usually don't talk too much about myself in the show, but today is going to be a little bit more personal. So just to give a little background, Cyrus and I are Iranian Americans. Both of our parents are from Iran, and they immigrated to the US a little over 30 years ago. And both of us were born here, we grew up here, and despite that, Persian and Iranian culture was a huge part of our upbringing. And so I'm curious if you could describe what culture really meant in our family when we were growing up.
Great. So, in terms of culture growing up in our family with our parents, as you well know, it was an important factor to them. They were very proud of their Persian heritage and really instilled that in us, putting us in Farsi classes when we were younger so we could learn to speak and write and read in Persian or Farsi. And that's something we did for years. Just on top of that, them carrying on various traditions through like Persian New Year, telling us old Persian poetry and kind of some of the mythology that they grew up learning. So those are the ways it was most prevalent in my life growing up. What would you say?
I totally agree. A huge priority for our parents was that we learn how to speak Farsi. And when I was born, and I'm about a year and a half older than Cyrus, our grandmother immigrated to the US just to help raise us because both of our parents were working and they couldn't stay home. And our grandmother only spoke Farsi. So both of our first languages was Farsi, and we didn't know any English until we went to preschool. And I think our parents were keenly aware of how important language is to any culture. And they were really aware of the history of colonization, where one of the first things colonizers do is take away the language of a group of people. And our parents wanted to build as many opportunities as they could for us. And that's why they had a huge emphasis on us learning Farsi. And so obviously it was a huge priority for our parents to be connected to our culture. But I'm curious for yourself, what did the Persian culture mean to you as a kid?
So my culture to me growing up, it was a huge part of me. Obviously, growing up, being raised by my parents who almost exclusively spoke Persian in the household or Farsi. And then my grandma, like you mentioned, she had moved here and pretty much came here for the babysitting gig. My parents didn't really believe in babysitters, and looking back on it, I'm pretty happy that I got to be raised while they were at work by my grandma, because that's just much more of a loving, nurturing relationship. But she only spoke Farsi, like you said, and so able to communicate with her and our grandpa while they were here taking care of us. That's when I felt a deeper connection with it. But when I look back on it now, I feel like my relationship with Persian culture really came down to relationships that I had with our parents and our grandparents, our family in general, aunts and uncles, and as well as our family friends. When you're a kid, you don't really get to decide who you get to hang out with all the time. And growing up, we'd obviously be going to my parents' friends' houses, and they were a part of a small, tightly knit Persian community here in Denver. So luckily, they all had a bunch of kids that were around me and Shadi's age, and we got to grow up with them. They were some of my best friends growing up. So to me, my connection with the Persian culture really comes down to the relationships, like I said, family, friends, um, and less so the actual like Iranian culture that you would experience like growing up and being surrounded in it, if that makes sense.
It does. And I love your answer so much because relationships are the pillars of any culture. Because what's a culture? It's a set of norms, traditions, and values that a group of people decide upon. And they practice those things together. But without relationships, then the culture wouldn't exist. So I love your answer. And I want to break down two really important things that you brought up, which one was our family and two was friends. So, starting off with family, when researchers look at the impact parents have on their child's cultural identity, they find that parents have a huge impact on inspiring exploration and curiosity. So, kids are more likely to test out relationships, like you said, try out values, traditions, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that the child will identify with the culture and continue to practice it as they get older. And the other great point you brought up was friend groups. So, peer relationships are really important to any young person's identity formation. And so much research shows that peer groups have the biggest influence on a young person's identity. And some researchers even go as far as to say that family relationships don't even matter. I wouldn't go to quite that extreme, but I definitely agree that peer relationships have a huge impact on our identity development. And what was really cool for us is that we got to have so many friends who were Iranian American like us. And there's this word in Farsi called dildari, which means basically heart to heart. And what was really beautiful is that you and I could dildari with Iranian American friends and talk about our experiences as Iranian Americans, talk about our experiences with our parents, and have a group of people who could understand our experiences and a place where we could feel comfortable and safe. So I think throughout our childhood and as we were growing up, we had different connections with our culture. And I think I was a little bit more connected with the Persian culture than you were. Would you agree?
I would agree. I would agree.
And I think a lot of siblings can relate to this experience that we have where while both of us were raised in the same house with the same culture, we have different connections to it. And so I'm curious, why do you think you have a different connection with our parents' culture than me?
I think that's a really great question. I think what separated our connection with our culture growing up, at least, was when I was probably around, I don't know, 10 years old maybe, and decided to, or I guess me and my parents, decided to put me in a competitive gymnastics program. It was something that I dealt with younger and just had gotten pretty good at, and it was recommended I go to some, a more elite program for gymnastics. So ended up joining this school with a special program where I only had to attend the core classes of, math, English, science, and history, and then I had no elective classes. Instead, I would spend 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon at the gym with other people who were competing, nationally to one day be on, junior Olympic teams and Olympic teams. And this is something I did for 4 or 5 years, and I think that was where our rift kind of started in terms of our identity or our relationship with our culture, because now I was going to a totally different school than you. I was, hanging out with totally new people, spending 3 or 4 hours a day with these people at the gym, also on the weekends, traveling to different cities and states to compete. And so that's where I think you may have developed more into our culture, spending more time with our family, going to more classes and stuff like that, and being more connected with the home life, whereas my focus kind of shifted from the home life to my new life, competing and everything like that. And then once I ended up quitting due to some injuries when I was older, I think once again I was thrown into a situation where now I had to go back to the school program that you were in, but I didn't know anybody. So I had to put a lot of time and energy into getting to know my peers and making whole new friends. And I think that is what I would attribute to our differences in our our connection with our culture. I feel like you kind of had more of a steady school life, which allowed you to spend more time at home, developing the cultural relationship, whereas I had to spend a lot of energy and time trying to find myself and find my people in these new schools and situations I was put in.
Wow, that's so true because for an extended period of time, we were in essentially completely different communities. And it makes sense that you had to put in a lot of time and energy in building relationships with the people in your school and didn't necessarily have the opportunity to hang out with the Iranian American community in the way that I did. And a reason that I felt so connected to the Iranian culture was because of discrimination that I experienced. So, growing up in America, I think many people from immigrant families experience discrimination. And for myself, I found safety in my parents' culture because even though I would go to school and I would experience uncomfortable things, I would tell myself, hey, that's okay because I actually have this other group of people who are like me, who understand me. And it gave me a lot of peace and safety. And when researchers actually look at the impact discrimination can have on immigrant families, it's a little bit mixed, but some research suggests that discrimination is associated with having a weaker American identity and a stronger ethnic cultural identity. And I definitely think in my case, that's what happened. And having had that culture to connect with and to have my back really saved my life.
100%, me too.
And there's an interesting pattern that psychologists have noticed in that women tend to have stronger connections and cultural identities compared to men in immigrant families. And some researchers suggest that maybe this is because men are granted greater social freedom to interact with American peers and American culture. And others suggest that maybe women have higher expectations to preserve and carry on cultural traditions. But I'm curious, if we were to look ahead and one day you were to have kids of your own, what role does Persian culture play in that, if any? Is it something that you want to teach your own kids?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's something I want my kids to learn about. And I'm going to do my best to pass that information along to them and hopefully have my mom, my dad, who, just like they did with us, share with them all the stories and all the mythology and especially all the history. I think that'd be great for them to know and kind of give them more of a sense of identity of what their dad's heritage is and whatnot. As far as like speaking Farsi, that is something that I would love for them to learn and to know. But I also see like the reality of it that it does become harder and harder as I'm obviously we're not from Iran, and so our connection to the language really came from our parents and our grandparents. Their connection would mainly come from me and my side of the family. I don't know who my wife is going to be kids with. Maybe she's Persian too, and that'll make them learning the language easier. But if she's not, it's tough for them to pick that up, and I see the reality of that. But I would love to put them in classes and get them more involved with it, and at least have some basic understanding of when their parent or when their grandparents are talking to them or anyone from my side of the family, when they're talking to them, that they at least understand what they're saying and have a general sense of what's going on in the conversation.
Absolutely. I feel the same way. And I also think about the language aspect and how every generation post-migration, there is a dilution in the language. But I love that you are proud of your culture and the experiences that you've had, and I would love to know what you think is so valuable about your cultural identity that you would want to pass on.
Everything, honestly. I feel so proud that I am Persian, and I think a lot of value that I get comes from the identity to help me form within myself. And obviously what I mentioned before, being able to communicate with our family and our relatives back home and just my extended family. I think it's hard to even put into words how valuable that is to me. But beyond that, I love that it gave me that sense of identity that I am growing up as a first generation American, and I have this really unique bicultural experience growing up. And I think that's something I really embraced. And beyond that, I love educating people on it. So growing up in that, hearing as much as I did about it from my mom, my dad, hearing all the stories and doing my own research, about the Persian empires and stuff like that. It's something I found very interesting, and it's something that I love to share with other people. So friends of mine, anytime they ask about this, or I'll bring up Persian New Year, and they'll ask what that's about. I'm really happy that I'm able to break it down and spread that information around, because I think a lot of people don't know it, and not their fault, because growing up here, they're not going to be teaching Persian culture in classes. So it is something that a lot of people find interesting when I do share it with them, and I'm really excited and blessed, honestly, that I have that a part of me, and that I have some general knowledge about it that I can spread around.
I love that. And that sense of pride that comes from having a cultural identity is so beautiful. And it's something that countless generations of people have had ripped away from them. And so I feel incredibly lucky that our parents had the opportunity to give it to us, and that maybe one day we'll have an opportunity to do the same. Well, thank you so much, Cyrus, for coming on the show today and recording this special family holiday edition. I had so much fun chatting with you.
Thanks for having me. Should we go get some lunch, or
Yes, let's go do it. Intro music was written by Optin Akrami. And if you're interested in the research I referenced, you can find a complete list on our website at cyborg.info.